Hello and welcome to the Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper, and thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. Just a quick reminder that Just and Sinner as an organization is listener and funder supported. It's a 501c3 nonprofit organization now, so your gifts are tax deductible. If you want to help us out with all the things we do here, go to justandsinner.org and click on the donate page. Now, for the program today, we have a guest with us who you have heard before if you listen to the program regularly or have been involved in events going on with the Widener Institute. We have Dr. Nathan Greeley here, who is our Fellow of Apologetics in Philosophical Theology. And we're going to be discussing the topic that many people ask me about pretty often, and that is presuppositional apologetics. So Dr. Greeley, thank you so much for being back.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here and happy to talk about an issue that I think is highly pertinent and one that probably is not discussed nearly enough, at least in Lutheran circles.
Yeah, it definitely is an issue. As I said, it's an issue that I get asked about a lot, especially because, I have so many Reformed listeners, but also people who kind of came from the Reformed into the Lutheran tradition and who wonder, what do we do with this whole presuppositional apologetics thing? How is it that we approach that from our perspective, and is that contrasted with the Reformed? But before we jump into the topic, I want to mention two things. And the first is that Nathan Greeley has recently contributed an article in a book on this topic from the Davenant Institute. This is called Without Excuse, Scripture, Reason, and Presuppositional Apologetics, edited by David Haynes. Now, this book is definitely more for a Reformed audience, dealing with, it's basically a critique from a Reformed perspective of presuppositional apologetics. Dr. Greeley, obviously being a Lutheran, was still asked to contribute, and you did an article in here that dealt with some earlier Reformed thinkers, Francis Turretin and Charles Hodge, and their apologetic method. And I think what you see, in those early Protestant scholastics, as we speak about someone like Francis Turretin, I don't see a substantial difference between where they're coming from the Reformed position and then from the Lutheran. And I also think it's interesting when you think about somebody like Charles Hodge, because when you're talking about apologetics in America, you really have to go back to the old Princeton theologians who are from a Reformed tradition. So you're thinking of the Hodges, both Charles and A. Hodge and B.B. Warfield and, William G.T. Shedd, those old Princeton theologians as they're known. And, at the time, I find it really interesting that a lot of their work was actually very much influenced by some Lutheran thinkers. So Ernst Ludhart was a huge influence on Charles Hodge's thinking and writing on apologetics as well, who was a German Lutheran thinker. So there is kind of this common heritage in both of those traditions, both the Lutheran and Reformed traditions, on some of these issues. Now, certainly they're going to depart ways on certain particulars and certain points. But I think there is a kind of common thread that really kind of shifts with presuppositionalism, where that part of the Reformed tradition has kind of gone off on its own in a way that departs from really the entire earlier Protestant tradition, but also just kind of in the classical apologetics tradition, even prior to the Reformation itself. So Dr. Greeley is also going to be teaching an upcoming seminar for us at the Widener Institute on the doctrine of God in St. Anselm. That is coming up August 22nd at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can go to justandsinner.org and go to the Widener Institute page to find out more information about that. So Dr. Greeley, I'll just give you a chance to kind of tell everyone what your course is about and plug it, let them know what's going on and why they should sign up. By the way, sorry to cut you off before you even start talking here, you can purchase Dr. Greeley's previous seminar on the natural knowledge of God in Gerhard and Thomas Aquinas. We do have that for sale as well if you're interested. So Dr. Greeley, go ahead and explain what your upcoming seminar is going to be about.
Well, Anselm is one of my favorite theologians. He's one of the most important theologians in the history of the church, especially for his work on the doctrine of God. He wrote two extremely influential and important treatises on the doctrine of God. And so my class will basically be a discussion of those treatises and an exploration of what he has to say to us and its contemporary relevance for the church.
Wonderful. So I'm sure it'll be a great class. So please check it out. If you sign up beforehand, you can be involved in live discussion. It will be available for purchase afterwards if you want to get the recording as well. So let's just kind of start at the basics when we're talking about this question of presuppositional apologetics. And that is, When we're talking apologetic methods, I think there are probably a lot of different definitions that people use that tend to even kind of be contradictory to one another of different approaches. I must have heard at least 5 very different definitions of what constitutes classical apologetics. So in light of that, I want to kind of define, what are we talking about? So first, let me just ask for you to explain, like, what are the main apologetic methods, and summarize what that means for us in as simple of a way as you can.
So basically, I think that there are 2 different approaches to apologetics. There's a lot of different variations within those 2 basic approaches, but I think that really boils down to 2. And those 2 are defined by the philosophies that they are predicated on, or that they're based on. The classical approach is founded on realism. The presuppositional approach is founded on what is typically called antirealism. Now, what do I mean by realism? I mean the view that the world is out there, it's objective, it stands over us, it determines our knowledge, in the sense that for us to have true knowledge, we have to know how the world really is. It's prior to our knowledge, and that we wouldn't be able to have knowledge unless there was a world out there to know. So that's realism. It has a long history in the church. It was first really developed in ancient Greece, and the church fathers adopted it, picked it up. It's been prevalent throughout the Middle Ages. It's always been the philosophy of the Christian church up until the 20th century, really, the late 19th century, perhaps. That's when anti-realism, which is the other approach I'm going to talk about in a second, started to kind of gain a foothold. So what is anti-realism? Anti-realism is basically the opposite of realism. It's the idea that knowing somehow determines being. Knowing is prior to being. Being receives its nature, its form, its structure through knowing. And what I think this means, really, is that knowing becomes indistinguishable from interpretation. Interpretation and knowing are the same thing, and to interpret reality is to know it is to interpret it. This way of thinking, it starts with Kant, really. That's who originates it. And it starts to gain a toehold or a foothold in the church, like I said, in the late 19th century. And then in the 20th century, it becomes quite prevalent. And I think presuppositionalism is the apologetic method that's based on anti-realism. There are some people that would probably disagree with that, but I think when you look at presuppositionalism, you look at the claims that are made by the major presuppositionalists, and I think it's quite obvious that they are committed to anti-realism, because realism just doesn't make sense given what they have to say about how apologetics should be done and what the needs are of the apologist. And so because of that, I think that it's clear that these 2 approaches are antithetical, and to understand one, you really have to understand the other.
Yeah, I think it's certainly going to be a controversial claim that you're making, that it is anti-realist. But I think some of the evidence for, the philosophical biases in these discussions are pretty evident just in looking at the questions of who today is it that is promoting classical theism, and asking the question, are those individuals classical apologists or presuppositionalists? And then asking the question, who is it in the Reformed world today that are the opponents of classical theism? And those tend to be presuppositional proponents. Now, it's probably not a exact one-to-one correlation, because I can certainly think of a few at least that are, I think of the Reformed Forum program, for example, and they tend to, they have interviewed James Dolezal and promote classical theism, but are also heavy presuppositionalists. And I kind of wonder how those 2 things fit together, because I think generally they don't work well together. But I think a large part of that is because of the philosophical convictions that underlie what people mean by classical theism, that also are the same presuppositions that were used in terms of apologetics. And all of that is kind of thrown out when we look at the beginnings of presuppositionalism. Even some of the formulations of the Trinity that we find in people like Cornelius Van Til who we're going to talk about a little bit, who speaks about God as both one person and three persons. There is this kind of shying away from language of substance or essence and moving into more personalized language, even to speak about God. So I think that there is this kind of broader philosophical background that you do have to look at as you're thinking through these issues. So why don't I want to get into that anti-realism a little bit and explore what
let me say a bit more, because I want to defend the claim a bit. What I mean by that is, or why I'm saying that presuppositionalism is anti-realist, is that when you read presuppositional thinkers, and there are a lot of them, and they disagree with each other on different points, but when you look at the major ones, and Van Til is probably the most influential, so it makes sense to focus on him. His focus is on how reality is interpreted. That's what he thinks most about. That's how he thinks in terms of. It's not about the knowledge process is not a matter of coming to terms with an objective reality. It's a matter of seeing things correctly. It's a matter of having the proper view. Okay, so worldview thinking is something that's very important to him. Now, worldview thinking is something that I think he inherited from Abraham Kuyper, and then that has a history that goes back through Wilhelm Dilthey, who was a late 19th century German philosopher who really introduced the notion of worldview and popularized it. And by that term, he just meant the way in which a particular group of people at a certain time conceive of the world, the way that the world appears to them, the way that the world is rendered intelligible for them. And he was indebted to Hegel, who talked about different forms of consciousness developing through history. At different times, people would understand the world in different ways. They would see the world in different ways. And Hegel is, of course, indebted to Kant, who would say that we don't know reality as it is in itself. We only know how it appears to us. So that's kind of the genealogy, I think, of presuppositionalism. It goes back to Dutch Calvinism, Kuyper in particular, and then it goes to Germany and to kind of the legacy of idealism there, and that you find in people like Dilthey, and then you go back to Hegel with his different forms of consciousness developing in history according to a dialectical process, and then you go back to Kant. But what all these people have in common is that they emphasize the fact that reality is in some sense posterior to interpretation. Okay, so interpretation is prior, and the way that things appear is dependent upon the knower, dependent upon the subject, and the categories or the means by which the subject interprets the world. So I see Van Til as belonging to that tradition. He's a part of that tradition, and that's why in his own writings he focuses on worldviews and about how things appear from the point of view of different worldviews. He doesn't talk about being or reality as it is, because that would assume some kind of neutral stance, which he doesn't think is possible. He thinks everybody has a perspective or a standpoint, and there's no way to get around that. There's no way to kind of get access to the real world. There is no real world, perhaps, to even know. So the question is, well, how then do we decide which interpretation is correct? How do we know that the atheist interpretation and the theist interpretation, how do we arbitrate between them? And what Van Til is going to say is that he's going to say that God is the ultimate interpreter. He's the authoritative interpreter. And so we know reality correctly, or we have the right viewpoint on reality, we're wearing the right lenses when we look at reality, when we have an interpretation of it that coincides with God's interpretation, that lines up with it. Now, I think one of the things that's problematic about this point of view is that it basically means that that things have the reality they do because God knows them in a certain way. It's not that God knows them because they have a certain reality, a certain kind of reality. Now, if we go all the way back, when we get to God himself, then we have to ask ourselves, is God's nature determined by his knowing, or is his knowing determined by his nature? And I think the consistent Van Tilian would have to say that in some sense, God's nature is determined by his knowing. But that's problematic because we want to say that God's nature is necessary. We don't want to say that there's some kind of act that's determinative of it. We want to say that it is the reality that determines all other acts, right? It's the bedrock reality. So we don't want to say that somehow God's knowing is determinative of his nature. That leads to a lot of absurdities, I think, and it opens the door to a kind of extreme voluntarism, where God is basically willing himself into existence almost. He's being a causa sui, or he's engaged in self-causation. And these things are obviously not things we really want to affirm, at least I don't think. Now, the Van Tillian, I don't know if Van Til actually does say such things. He probably doesn't. But I'm just saying that I think that the anti-realist viewpoint, which says that interpretation is prior to being, this is kind of its logical conclusion. This is where it goes. You get to God, and his interpreting is prior to his own being, which is something that I don't think we want to affirm. So for the realist, or for the classicalist, they're going to want to say that God's nature is determinative of his knowing. He knows himself as he is, objectively and necessarily. It's not the case that his nature is somehow determined by his knowing. And because of that, we're going to also want to say that with respect to everything else, God's knowledge of it is reflective of what it really is. It's not the case that his knowledge is somehow determinative of it, or that he's interpreting reality and making it what it is by that process. We want to say that God is all-knowing, not all-interpreting. I think that's a good way of describing the distinction.
Yeah, I think that's good, and it's important to say, and as you already nuanced this, to say the Van Tillian probably isn't going to go down this road and make these kind of conclusions, right? And there are some who do make the kinds of conclusions that God determines his own being in one way or another. You find this in a lot of process theology, but even a lot of Barthian theology as well, and which is interesting because I do think there are some strong parallels between Van Til and Barth. As much as Van Til was one of Barth's biggest critics, that's kind of a discussion for another day. But I think they do kind of start in some ways on the same place, which is why Barth rejects natural theology, whereas Van Til kind of rejects natural theology, or at least a classical way of approaching natural theology, as much as he's going to want to affirm certain conceptions of arguments for the existence of God, or at least he will certainly say that he affirms them, though I'm not sure in practical use how they really function. I think that's one of the difficulties that they have. So let's dive into, let me just ask you the question, because there may be some people listening to this that are like, I have no idea what's going on here. Who are you guys talking about? So let's kind of back up and just say,
okay. Sure.
Kind of who is Van Til and what are the basics? Let's get into this idea of the antithesis, just some of the basic conceptions of Van Til's approach to apologetics.
Okay, sure. So Van Til was a Calvinist theologian and philosopher who was raised in the Dutch tradition, and he went to Princeton, and he was hired at Westminster Seminary by J. Gresham Machen. And he had a long career there. He was the main apologetics guy for decades. And because of that, and because of the influence that Westminster Seminary has had on the Reformed world, his views have been extremely influential. And it's gotten to the point that a lot of people kind of think of presuppositionalism as simply what you have to believe to be fully Reformed, or to be purely Reformed. When I used to be Reformed myself, I was first reading about presuppositionalism. I was intrigued by it, and I thought it was interesting how it was kind of presented, or how it was sold as being, a apologetic that takes the Bible seriously, unlike others, an apologetic that takes human depravity seriously, unlike others. And I don't think that those claims hold a lot of water at this point, but at the time, I could see what people found attractive about it and why it was so influential, because it does appear, at least prima facie, it appears to really be maybe a more biblical apologetic, but at least that's how it's presented. But I don't think that ultimately that actually holds up. So anyways, Van Til was, like I said, very influential. He wrote a lot of books. His books are not the easiest books to understand. He's not a very clear thinker, and he appears to contradict himself constantly. And that's one thing that is so frustrating about him. When you discuss his views with a proponent of them, I oftentimes find that the proponent will disagree with almost anything you say because somewhere Van Til actually, did affirm this, or he did deny this.
That
even
sounds
though,
like Bart.
yeah, exactly. So it's very difficult to pin down exactly what Van Tilianism is. What I'm doing here today is I'm just trying to kind of articulate what I see as kind of a consistent viewpoint based on what he tends to affirm in his books. So I'm sure there will be people that disagree with the points that I've made already and points that I'm going to make later on, but this is, from reading Van Til, this is about the best I can do with trying to put together a consistent viewpoint that seems to kind of follow from a certain set of principles.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in the confusion of Van Til's writings. Yeah, and I imagine Bart is a similar figure. There are certain figures who are kind of looming in theology, and I feel like part of the reason why they're so significant is because you can write so much about them, because their writing is so convoluted that you can almost take any view from them. I mean, you find the same thing in philosophy with the likes of Hegel and Heidegger and some others as well. But Van Til is not the easiest to understand, and I think that probably the biggest influence that Van Til really has is through the interpretation of Greg Bahnsen, probably more than anybody else, because Bahnsen was one who popularized his works and I think brought it to a more lay level. Nowadays, you have a lot of kind of lay or even street apologists using elements of presuppositionalism, while I don't think really even understanding the basic philosophical foundations of the movement. So I'm not sure how accurately that really portrays what Van Til himself was really even trying to do. But I think you point on some really significant things, and there's so much we could talk about here. One thing I want to do is I want to look at some of the claims of those who follow more the presuppositional mode that will be used as criticisms of other ways of doing apologetics. So there are certain things that you often hear if you say, I'm a classical apologist, or someone claims to be an evidential apologist, whatever method you want to use. A presuppositionalist will often, there are certain phrases that you'll often hear. Like one of those is one that I've often heard, and it really comes kind of from Francis Schaeffer, and I think his misinterpretation of Aquinas. But there is this claim that if you reject presuppositional apologetics, then you believe that the human intellect is unfallen. I think there's an assumption that if either you believe that the whole of man is fallen or affected due to sin, or what you have is this kind of morally neutral intellect in a classical or evidential approach, and therefore you don't take sin as seriously as the presuppositionalist does. So how would you respond to that criticism?
Right. So that's basically the foundation of the antithesis, or this view that believers have a different worldview than unbelievers, and they're incommensurable, and there's no point of neutrality in between them. There's nothing that they can agree on, at least according to their principles. Their principles point them in completely opposite directions. Now, what the Van Tilian says, or what Van Til says, oftentimes he says that believers don't know anything, and this obviously sounds very strange. So he walks it back in different ways. What he says is that they do know things insofar as they smuggle in surreptitiously a Christian worldview. Okay, so I think the best way to visualize what he's saying is think of somebody wearing glasses with two very different lenses. Okay, they have their non-Christian worldview, which is one lens, which gives them basically no correct information because the way it sees the world is not in line with the way God sees the world, right? So we talked about how God interprets the world, right, and how man interprets the world, and you get a correct interpretation when yours lines up with God's. So with that one lens that is the non-Christian worldview, you don't get anything correct with that lens. That lens is purely false. With your Christian worldview lens that you are surreptitiously smuggling in and denying, but at the same time making use of, you are seeing reality correctly. So what happens when you put those both on, you have your one set of glasses with two lenses, is that you don't see anything right, but you're never entirely wrong. Okay, so you are able to function in the world. You're able to, be a doctor. You're able to be a lawyer, whatever. These things you can still do, and you can still operate a car. It's not like you're helpless, right? But the idea is that if you didn't have that Christian lens in there that you're actually denying that you have, you actually would be, I guess, as helpless as an infant, probably, and totally unable to reason or know anything. So all of the knowledge that you have is predicated on that Christian view that you are denying with your mouth, but you're unable to completely suppress, in your mind or in your soul.
So with that, where would you, in terms of natural revelation, right? Natural theology, that's going to be a big part of these discussions, because the Van Tillian is certainly going to say our view is the scriptural one. Of course, everybody's going to say that, or if they care about what scripture says, which of course, on both sides of this debate, we certainly are taking scripture very seriously and want to speak as scripture speaks. There are certain passages that the presuppositionalists will use. They'll speak about text to talk about the fallenness of the intellect, right? They'll they'll speak about the particular text that I often hear is the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, right? To say that there is a necessity in fearing the Lord that then leads to your wisdom or your knowledge. Therefore, your knowledge presupposes knowledge of God in some sense. And I think we can spend some time looking at whether that's really talking about something that is consistent with Van Til in the first place. I'm not convinced that it is. But let's just ask the question about natural theology. And let's say, where does scripture teach that there is true and real knowledge of the unbeliever, especially that would be valuable in the questions of apologetics, such as basic questions of the existence of God, thinking about something like Aquinas's 5 ways, or even Anselm's arguments for the existence of God, the ontological argument, and other things?
Well, I think the Bible it seems to me that it always assumes that non-believers are able to, function in the world, they have knowledge of mundane things, certainly. Yeah. Spiritually, they're blind. That's true.
Right.
But when it comes to the kinds of things that would be dealt with by philosophy, in its older, broader sense, they're able to do those things. They're able to discover truths about the world, about the cosmos, about human nature. So these things are not completely off limits to them. I think when it comes to natural theology, the consistent presuppositionalist should deny that it's possible or that it has any reality. The reason why I see that is because things don't have any intrinsic significance for the presuppositionalist, for the anti-realist. They only have the significance that you bring to them with your worldview, with the lenses that you have on, with which you see the world. So there's no intrinsic nature in things that points to a creator. There's nothing there that's going to point beyond itself by its very nature. And I think that classical apologetics assumes that is the case. The realist assumes that is the case. Things have their own intelligibility, their own intrinsic significance. And what it means to learn or to know is to discover that significance and to follow it and to see what its implications are, see what its entailments are. So, and I think that's true of historical evidences too. The Van Tillian is not going to say that historical facts have some kind of inherent significance. It all depends on how they're interpreted. And you see this when they'll talk about like the events of Jesus's life. They'll say, well, these things have no inherent significance apart from how they're interpreted. And whereas the classical apologist or the realist is going to say that actually facts do constrain what counts as a good interpretation. The facts themselves have their own intrinsic significance that limits what can count as a good or bad interpretation. And so you see that the anti-realist viewpoint, it really does, I think, lead to a kind of gross subjectivism where things only have any kind of significance because they're given those things, or it's brought to them through the interpretations that are imposed upon things. And so for that reason, I don't think that natural theology or historical evidences can really play a part in a Van Tillian view perspective. So because of that, I think once you rule those things out, no natural theology, no historical evidence, what are you left with? right? How do you do apologetics at that point? That's the question, right? And because those are the main traditional modes in which apologetics have been done. We talk about arguments for the existence of God. We talk about evidence for the resurrection, things like that. But for the Van Tillian, these things are not feasible. So what he does is he claims that we can show that the non-believer has an inconsistent worldview. We don't try to argue with them on the basis of evidence or rational arguments, because the claim is their worldview is incommensurable with ours, okay? And they're not going to interpret things the same way that we do. So they're not using these kinds of historical evidences and rational arguments is pointless, because it's not going to resonate with them at all, because they don't see things that way. So what we have to do is we need to just point out that there's some intrinsic or inherent inconsistency in their own worldview. And the idea is that by doing that, we will be able to show them that they should be Christian. They should adopt a Christian worldview. Instead of having those two lenses where one is Christian and one is non-Christian, they should replace the non-Christian lens with the Christian one, and then they'll have a completely consistent way of viewing things. Now, I see a couple problems with that. One is that actually showing that all non-Christian worldviews are inconsistent seems like an impossible task. It seems like a monumental task. I'm not sure how you would actually do that when engaging like a non-believer in a typical conversation. How are you going to show that all non-Christian worldviews are inconsistent? I just don't see that as being possible, especially considering there are a lot of other theistic worldviews that in a lot of ways, seem rather plausible. Maybe not in every way, certainly not in every way, but when it comes to like God's existence and things like that, I mean, there are lots of religions that affirm some kind of deity. So I don't think showing that they're all inconsistent is really conceivable. But then furthermore, the presuppositionalist, the Van Tillian, claims that Christianity, Reformed Christianity specifically, is the only consistent worldview, the only logically consistent worldview. And I think that from our point of view as knowers, it's actually not entirely consistent. And I'm not saying it's not entirely consistent from God's point of view, but I'm saying from our point of view, I think that it's hard to, it's a very hard case to make, to say that Christianity is completely consistent, completely coherent. I think there are mysteries. There are things that we can't figure out, things that we can't understand. And so how do we claim that the non-believer has an inconsistent worldview and ours is perfectly consistent, but at the same time we have these things that appear to be contradictions to the non-believer and that we ourselves are unable to explain? So I'm not sure how you make a case with that method or using that means. It seems to me that it falls flat.
Yeah, I think that gets at what is one of, I think, the major issues with presuppositionalism is it really only works when you're dealing with a non-theistic system. Because if you look at even, prominent apologists who are presuppositional in their orientation, when they're engaging in, say, Islam or, Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormonism, what they really do is revert to the exact same arguments to deal with those systems that a classical or an evidential apologist would. So it does seem that the system really only works in one particular context, and that is within a maybe pure materialist, non-theistic approach to the world.
Right.
And I'm not convinced that those arguments really work. And I don't think they've ever been consistently used to formulate an apologetic in other ways. So, I would be interested in seeing if somebody has come up with a way to try and do that. And I've seen some say that they're working on it and they're, looking for ways to do it. But I'm just not sure that it really is possible or works, because you all end up going to positive arguments to some degree. Or
right. And like I said, I think those positive arguments don't really make sense given the presuppositions of presuppositionalism. So I do think that they're kind of stuck in a conundrum there.
Yeah, I see that too, especially in, it's often, at least the presuppositionalists that I often speak with. And, at one time I would have called myself a presuppositionalist when I first looked into some of these issues when I was Reformed. But, as I thought through these issues, one of the things that really stuck out to me as I was reading presuppositional literature and speaking to people who were presuppositional, was that they would often say that they affirmed the use of arguments They would often say, no, we don't say that we can't make arguments for the existence of God. But it never, but every time I saw it used, it was criticized. So it always felt to me more like something that was theoretical rather than real. And I have yet to see a presuppositionalist who really affirms arguments for the existence of God in any real way, other than just affirming, I know this is good, but not really knowing what to do with them. I mean, I think maybe the only, person that I would point at that has done that to an extent is John Frame, but John Frame also is critical of presuppositionalism as a kind of antithetical method to classical apologetics as well. So I know he's kind of got his own perspective, which doesn't really identify with
trying to
the mainstream.
Find a mediating position.
Yes. Yeah. I think so. And I think, as we're talking about this, there's so many things that come to mind, and there's so much that we could talk about. But as we're thinking specifically about some of those philosophical issues and the philosophical shifts, I'm thinking about this because I just released my book dealing with all of these things, but specifically thinking through the rise of modern philosophy, even going back to nominalism and then through someone like Descartes. What we see, which is represented in presuppositionalism in a form, is there ends up being this shift from questions of metaphysics to questions of epistemology, right? This shift from questions of being to questions of knowing. And we see that shift. Of course, it's going to take place in apologetics because the world is shifting and the questions that people are asking are changing. So it kind of just makes sense that would happen. But why don't we kind of go back and say, what is it that made that shift, right? Where does, because you can point at Kant and the noumenal phenomenal divide, but I think it really goes far before that. Descartes is usually considered the father of modern philosophy. Oftentimes it's said that nominalism kind of begins, what is antirealism, that leads to eventually what you find in Kant. So let's kind of just take a walk through the basic, the rise of modern philosophy. How does that shift go where people at one point just, which is common sense, people just assume that which they experience in the world corresponds to something that is real in their mind.
Right.
And
so
that
Descartes,
changes.
Yeah. He introduces the problem of the external world, really. He's the first person to kind of set that on the agenda. And he's trying to defeat radical skepticism. So he starts by assuming that he can't know anything except that he exists, of course. And then he tries to find a way to show that the world does really exist. And the way he does that is through proving that God exists. And his method has been criticized a lot, and it's been pointed out that he's inconsistent for thinking that he can prove that God exists when he's supposedly doubting everything, including his own faculties. So he sets that on the agenda, that difficult problem of how do we know that there's a real world out there that corresponds to what we perceive and what we experience. And there were many attempts to kind of solve this problem in the early modern period after Descartes, and it didn't go so well. Eventually you end up with Hume, who is kind of an arch skeptic, and he says that we have no way of knowing what the external world is like or whether it exists at all. And he set the agenda for Kant, who wants to solve this problem still that Descartes, introduced. He's still looking for a solution. And he reads Hume, and he's very perturbed by what Hume has to say and by his skepticism. And so he tries to solve the problem by achieving a kind of objectivity, but it's an objectivity that only exists in the subject. So all human beings, for Kant, they interpret the world in the same way, or they have their mind functions as like a filter through which they organize the world and give it a structure and a significance, but it's all subjective. It's all inside the mind. So Kant doesn't really solve the problem. He just transforms it, and actually he denies that there is an external world to know. There is just the world that appears to us, and it's there are lots of questions and problems that this raises, like, well, why do we all experience the same world, or how do we know that we're all experiencing the same world? Because it seems like it leads to solipsism. It seems like it leads to the view that everybody has their own little world that they exist in. It's all in their minds. It's all in their heads. And this problem has just never really gone away. The only way, I think, to deal with it is to go back before Descartes and just assume that the external world is not a problem, that we have to assume that we do have access to it, that our faculties are reliable, and that they enable us to be in contact with the world and to know it as it really is. Otherwise, if we don't make that assumption, I don't think there's any way to avoid skepticism and a denial that there is a real objective world out there that we can have knowledge of.
Yeah, this really goes back to that medieval debate between nominalism and realism. And when you're coming from a realist perspective, it really is not a problem. The question of whether the external world exists or whether my sense experience corresponds to reality. I mean, of course, you do have those exceptional cases of people with psychiatric issues and things like that see and hear things that aren't real. But as I look out my window right now, I see trees in my front yard. Right, as from a realist perspective, there is such a thing as a tree. It's an actual thing, right? It has an actual essence. And whether you're coming from a more Aristotelian or Platonic perspective, there's sort of different approaches within what is realism. Either way, there is such a thing as an actual tree, and that is an idea, right? And that idea is in my head, and the idea that's in my head also is inherent in the object itself. So what you have is this natural connection between the intellect or the idea and the thing itself. What happens is when you get rid of realism, well, now there's no such thing as tree. There are only individual things that we decide to categorize as trees in our mind or with language or however you want to express it in either conceptualist or nominalist perspective. Now, all of a sudden, you have the question of, well, what is a tree anyway? Because we're just kind of categorizing it. So maybe this counts as a tree, or maybe this counts as a tree for somebody, but it doesn't for somebody else, because they're just these kind of man-made categories. So it really is a problem that starts there. And I think presuppositionalism is, in some way, it's a very natural, I think, Christian response to what's going on with Kant and skepticism, but it hasn't shed those Kantian presuppositions in the first place. It's still working from that same framework, which is exactly what you see Barth doing, right? This is really at the heart of what is Barth's rejection of natural theology in his debates with Brunner, is that he can't accept the idea that we can simply have knowledge of God's existence from the created world. We have to start with an idea that then leads to an acceptance of creation as that which belongs to God. For example, there's a statement in his, it's in his mini Christian dogmatics, what those lectures on dogmatics, whatever it's called. Anyway, his mini church dogmatics volume. I remember coming across this statement when I first read that, and I said, that sounds a lot like Van Til, where Barth says, I do not believe in the material world because I sense it. I believe in it because Christ proved it to be real by entering into it. And that, for Barth, that's a Christocentric way of viewing the world. In other words, all knowledge starts with Christ. And the only reason I trust my sense experience is because I know Christ first, and I know that he has become incarnate in this world, therefore this world exists. And that is a huge, very radical shift. I don't think you'll find that kind of language, at least as far as I've seen, within Christianity at least prior to Kant or prior to Descartes. Maybe you find it earlier than that, but I haven't seen it.
No, I don't think you would, because it definitely, from the realist standpoint, and from, I think it's basically the common sense standpoint that most human beings operate with, sounds very counterintuitive, right? It sounds like a very strange claim. It might sound very pious, it might sound impressive from that point of view, but it also sounds like nonsense to some extent. Now, one of the issues that I think Van Tilians have is that they claim to know about God's perspective or his interpretation of things, the way that he sees the world, by knowing the Bible, right? The Bible is their means of knowing that. But if the Bible doesn't have any intrinsic significance of its own, it's an object in the world. So therefore, on the Van Tilian point of view, it seems like the only significance it could have is how it's interpreted, the significance it has through or via interpretation. Well, then how does it function as a revelation from God? If we're stuck within our worldviews, if we're stuck within the categories and the concepts that we bring to things within the interpretations that we operate with already. How do we receive a revelation from God, an objective, intrinsically significant revelation? I don't think that there is really a consistent way of saying that that's possible. And because of that, I think the only way for the Van Tillian to say that we have access to God's interpretation, because prior to knowing his interpretation, all we have is our own, which is a non-Christian interpretation. So how could we know the Bible or understand it or interpret it correctly? I think they have to say that God somehow directly reveals knowledge to us, apart from means, So I think it kind of sets up a kind of enthusiasm, or it suggests that at least, because I don't see how the Bible or anything in the created world can function as a means to know God if these things in the world don't have their own intrinsic significance, if they don't have this inherent intelligibility that constrains interpretation, that determines what a good interpretation is.
Yeah, I think that's a really significant point, and really, really interesting thing to think about there. So I know we're kind of getting closer to the end of time, so we don't have too much time left, and there's still a number of issues that we certainly could spend time on in this question. I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about kind of how this works in a Lutheran context, or what the relationship is between what these debates are in the Reformed world and what they are in the Lutheran context, because people maybe asking that question, what does this have to do with our church? So kind of, if you would give us an idea, what is the state of apologetics within Lutheranism today? And, where can we go to find those who are doing apologetics from our tradition?
Well, most Lutheran apologists today are in the classical camp, I would say, broadly speaking. The most famous Lutheran apologist of modern times, of course, is J.W. Montgomery, who is perhaps best described as an evidentialist, but his basic point of view is realist, and therefore I think he could be categorized as a classical apologist. He appeals to historical evidences. He also affirms that there are valid arguments for the existence of God. So I think that more or less he's in the classical camp. And then there are some others that have written books. Alan Quist wrote an introductory book recently that's quite good. But Montgomery has been the main person. I think he's kind of set the agenda for Lutheran apologetics for the past 50 years or so. And we don't really have a very strong apologetic tradition in our church besides a few figures. I think just because we don't tend to emphasize the importance of reason and faith, and I think for that reason, apologetics tends to be discounted, or tends to the importance of it tends to be downplayed. But it's still a necessity. There's a right way of doing it from a Lutheran point of view, and a wrong way. Obviously, we don't want to be rationalists. We don't want to affirm that we have to understand things before we can believe them. We want to work with the opposite point of view, or the faith-seeking understanding perspective. That's what we want to go for. But it is important that we provide reasons, of course, for why people believe what they do. And I do think that the best way to do that, based on the Lutheran tradition and the kinds of things that we have held in the past, is to affirm the classical point of view. I think that's the most consistent with the Lutheranism of the 16th and 17th centuries, where you see Lutherans making a lot of use of Aristotle. They're obviously indebted to the medieval tradition in different ways. And so they to unanimously affirm that what we've been calling the classical point of view. They're realists, all of them. And because we also focus in Lutheranism on objectivity, the objectivity of the means of grace, the word, I think also we don't want to be talking a lot about interpretation as prior to being, or as prior to reality, or having some kind of determinative influence on reality. We want reality to shape us. We don't want to be people that are thinking of ourselves as shaping reality.
Yeah, and I do want to say, there is a very rich apologetic tradition within Lutheran history. And I do find this today in certain individuals that I've criticized who basically retreat from apologetics altogether. That was their way with dealing with criticisms of the faith. You see pietism doing this. And I think a lot of pietism rose largely during the Enlightenment period because it was a way to retreat into emotion and experience and not really deal with what were the rational arguments against the faith in the Enlightenment era. But if you look at 17th century writers, as you already mentioned, someone like Johann Gerhard provides very strong arguments for the existence of God, echoes the same ones that Aquinas uses, and Anselm and Augustine and others. But you also have in the 19th century a big revival of an apologetic tradition within Lutheranism, facing just the challenges of things like higher criticism and unbelief, secularism in general. You find people like Milton Valentine in the United States, who has a couple volumes dealing with apologetic questions. Or you have Ernst Ludhard, who I already mentioned, who does he has got a series of 3 books of apologetic lectures that were very influential, even on some of those Princeton thinkers like Charles Hodge and B.B. Warfield. So there is a very strong apologetic tradition. That's why I'm excited to have you, on board with us and doing some things in this realm. I think it's so important, and I'd love to see more people involved in these apologetic issues. I just don't think that presuppositionalism has the rational grounds to really do the necessary apologetic work in our post-Christian society. I think that the way that certain, especially kind of pop apologists, use presuppositionalism doesn't really do much good. It kind of does the opposite in some ways, I think. So I love this return to classical apologetics. I think it's really important. But one thing I do want to talk about before we do end here soon is something that you brought up in the seminar that you led for us on natural knowledge of God, which is, of course, sorry about the cars driving by. I'm sure you can hear them. But you brought up in the seminar that we had on the natural knowledge of God in both Gerhard and Thomas Aquinas. And that is that for the Lutheran scholastics, there is this distinction between the knowledge of God that is innate in that which is acquired. So there's kind of an a priori and a posteriori sense of our knowledge of God. And I think what the criticism is, and this may be true of certain evidential apologists, but it's not true in the classical tradition at least. But one of the critiques I see from presuppositionalists is that all that we have in terms of our belief in things like the existence of God is just this kind of probability, right? Or a knowledge of this a posteriori knowledge that basically posits God as, the best theory out there. In other words, well, we've got a lot of complexity in the world, kind of going back to the William Paley type arguments that are very popular in the 19th century. There's a lot of complexity in the world, and the best way to explain it is that God exists, so God probably exists, therefore I'm a Christian. I think that's probably a valid criticism, at least of some in that tradition following Paley. But I don't think it's a valid criticism when you're looking at the scholastic era. So if you could kind of address that criticism, that because I've heard Van Til say this, and if you listen to, there are a series of lectures that Van Til has on apologetics you can listen to online. That's terrible recording quality because it's very old. But I remember a line that he has in one of those lectures where he says, the evidential apologist says God probably exists. And saying God probably exists is like going to your wife and saying, I probably love you. And so the question is that all we have? Do we have this from a classical approach? Do we just have this kind of probability? Or in our heart, we say, there's kind of a, 80-20% chance that God exists because the arguments tend to show that, but it could go the other way. I just don't think it does. So if you could just expand on that criticism.
I think we have demonstrative arguments, and I think they're about as good as arguments can be. Now, does that mean that they're, it's impossible that they could be wrong? No, I don't think we can. I mean, certainty is like, how much certainty is enough certainty? That's kind of the question, I think. And I think we have totally adequate certainty. I think we have all the certainty that we could want. We know that the theistic point of view makes way more sense and is way more likely to be true than any other. And so for that reason, I don't see why some kind of greater certainty is needed. If I have good arguments and they're persuasive arguments, and they're strong enough for me to stake, my life and the way that I live and my aims and aspirations on, I don't see why I should need anything more, and I certainly don't think Van Til provides anything more. If anything, I think he provides a lot less. So I think that these arguments, they're the best we can do. They're good arguments. They should convince any reasonable, open-minded person. The fact that they often don't is just a sign of, innate depravity and an unwillingness to consider the truth. But I don't find that objection to have any teeth, really.
Yeah, I think the thing that I was thinking in terms of that distinction that I mentioned between this kind of inherent internal knowledge of God is that, this isn't to say, right, that every Christian's faith is based on primarily rational argumentation. I mean, with the majority of people, it's not true, right?
Sure.
It's just not in the experience. But I think, what Van Til gets at in terms of we do have this internal knowledge, I think you can get that with the classical approach without all of the baggage that Van Til is trying to get at. In other words, we can say that there is a natural knowledge of God that is in the heart of every person. I mean, Gerhard says this. This is within the scholastic tradition, with the Protestant scholastic.
Yes, these are not opposed views at all.
Right,
They're totally consistent, right?
And that's the point. The reason I'm bringing this up is because I often see that side of what is the classical approach is ignored by a lot of presuppositional critics. They only see that
it's ignored by a lot of classical apologists too, unfortunately, who kind of assume that we have to start with arguments and we can't even, there's nothing prior than that. People are like a tabula rasa, right? They're a blank slate, and you need to give them arguments, which isn't the case.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's why that is a valid criticism. I think it's a very valid criticism. But I don't think that it represents the entirety of the classical tradition, at least in a Protestant sense. And I know you kind of brought up some of the differences between, Aquinas doesn't really have that strong idea of the natural knowledge of God. He seems to focus on that a posteriori through logical reasoning. But I also think, the one thing that I do want to bring up in that as well is to say, I think we have to make a distinction between the kind of metaphysical arguments that someone like Thomas Aquinas provides and what are more probabilistic arguments. In other words, I think when we're speaking metaphysically, when we're talking about the existence of God, we're talking about that which is logically a metaphysical necessity. And I think that, right. That's the point of Aquinas' arguments. I mean, if he's right, and I think that's what someone like Ed Feser and other contemporary more Thomistic thinkers are trying to argue these days, is it's not just, and I think this is a genuine problem with kind of post-Paley evidential apologists. If you look at something like the intelligent design movement, for example, and while I think that there's plenty of good that those thinkers have done in many ways, when you're speaking about just say, complexity in the world, whether it's specified complexity or irreducible complexity, those kinds of things don't really necessitate God's existence. They necessitate
inductive.
Right. Go ahead.
Inductive arguments are only going to lead to a probable conclusion, right?
Exactly.
So with those kinds of arguments, we're only going to say probably there's a designer here.
Right.
With the demonstrative arguments or with the deductive arguments that we see, like in Aquinas, they are stronger. They do have a necessary conclusion. The only thing that could make them false is if the premises are false. And personally, I don't think that there's any chance that the premises are false. However, they do depend on things that could conceivably be denied, like the principle of causality. You could deny that everything that begins to exist has a cause, and then those arguments wouldn't work.
Right.
But then you have to ask yourself honestly, do I really not believe in the principle of causality? And I think most people, when it comes down to it, deep down inside, they believe it. And so to deny it is just to kind of try to skirt the issue, I think.
Yeah, I think so too.
To avoid the conclusion.
Yeah, no, I think so too. And the reason I even bring this up is just because I know a lot of people who go toward presuppositionalism were raised with a kind of evidential apologetic that wasn't very strong. I mean, it wasn't based on great evidence. They were probabilistic arguments. And I think what's really causing a lot of people to shift over into classical apologetics more so now is that there has been so much work done on Aquinas and the five ways that has demonstrated that these are really a very different kind of argument. And at least the popular level, even way of construing those arguments has been, it has not been portrayed well. But I think arguments of metaphysical necessity, as I said, I really think that is where we want to stake our logical argumentation if we're speaking about the existence of God, which then, we have the other arguments that kind of play a secondary role, I think, that are good and helpful, but probably not the foundation that we need. And I think
Right. I mean, I think a good cosmological argument is about the best argument that we have, and then there are lots of other ones that are supplementary and that are useful. But I do think that a good deductive cosmological argument, it's about as good of an argument as you can find. I mean, there are not really philosophical arguments that I think are stronger. So for that reason, any claim that somehow we're doing something that doesn't lead to certainty or doesn't give us a solid ground to base our faith on, I just don't think it holds much water at all. And like I said earlier, when I was criticizing the Van Tillian method and talking about how they need to show that entire worldviews are inconsistent, well, it seems to me there'd be a lot of room for uncertainty in that procedure. So I don't think that they have any more grounds for confidence than the classical apologist does.
Yeah, in that way, I think that's true. I mean, of course, we're Lutherans, so we revel in paradox, right? So we don't need to make sense of everything.
Well, that's another reason why we shouldn't be presuppositionalists, is because the whole method of presuppositionalism is kind of based on this premise that paradox is bad, and that if you have paradox, that's a sign of untruth, or that's a sign of falsehood. And so we want to definitely avoid that, and we want to base our faith not on the fact that we have a completely consistent point of view on everything, but on the fact that there are things within our point of view that tell us truths about God and about ourselves that are reliable. So, a correct worldview for a Lutheran should be, it's a worldview that acknowledges the most important facts in reality, but it's not a worldview that interprets the world, or it's not, by that, what I should say is, we're not saying that we interpret the world the right way. We're saying that we know that the things in the world, the truths of the world that are important to know, and because of that, that's what it means to have a proper Christian worldview.
Yeah, and I think this also does, just play into our idea of the two kingdoms, right? This is an area where those who are kind of in the presuppositional school of thought, because every fact is interpreted, that means that there has to be a Christian approach to every discipline.
Everything, right.
And with our conception of the two kingdoms within the Lutheran tradition, we have this understanding that there is this kind of common realm where believers and unbelievers exist together and can even exist for the common good. And that doesn't mean that Christians don't think differently about their positions. I mean, we have a greater understanding of the purpose and function of ourselves and the world and others around us than non-believers do, certainly. But there is a common place, and there is to an extent, there is a common ground that we have because we are created in the image of God. It doesn't mean common as in they're autonomous creatures, which is how I feel like presuppositionalists often portray it. But common in that we are created by God, and there is what is referred to as a civic righteousness, even in the part of the unbeliever, and that means that someone like a Plato or an Aristotle could use their God-given intellects to come to very important truths about reality. That doesn't mean that they're going to use their logic to conclude that the Son of God would come to this earth and die on the cross for our sins, but they can come to some very important truths about reality, including the nature of there at least being a self-sufficient creator and first cause, who is primary. So
right. So Christianity, we would want to say it adds to our storehouse of facts.
Yes.
It doesn't give us a completely new set.
Right.
There's not like some replacement going on. There's simply, nature is being perfected by grace, basically. Right. We're getting more knowledge of things. We're understanding things better than the non-believer does, but we're not believing things that they don't, at least in every case. So, it's all about putting the emphasis on the world that's there, that determines us, and not the other way around.
So as a final concluding question here, I want to ask, what do you think the state is of apologetics today? Because you were involved in, this project from Davenant, and it seems like there are more voices today that are speaking against what was the kind of reigning paradigm, at least for quite a while in at least in the American Reformed Church, of presuppositional apologetics. So what do you see going on from those who are Reformed around you? Do you see that there is a shift in a direction away from presuppositional apologetics?
I would say so, but I mean, I know a lot of Reformed people, but I might just know all the same kinds of Reformed people. I don't know, but and the people that I know tend to, think that Thomism is great. They tend to appreciate classical apologetics. They appreciate scholasticism, and for that reason, most of the people that I interact with, they see presuppositionalism as a misstep, as a movement in the wrong direction, and they want to, correct the course that they're on. They want to go back to these older resources and make use of those going forward. And I think that's right, because I don't think that when it comes to apologetics, we need to, I think, determine the value of an apologetic method based on how persuasive it really is, based on how useful it really is in the context of discussion and debate. And I don't think presuppositionalism actually functions that well in those contexts. It might sound great in a book written, that's written by a Reformed author for a Reformed reader, and they might both enjoy the book immensely. But when it comes to actually engaging with people in real life, I don't think presuppositionalism is actually all that effective. And so, for that reason, I think that going forward, as the culture becomes more anti-Christian, and as the culture becomes, as our beliefs start to make less sense to them, I think we're going to need apologetic methods that actually do a good job of persuading people in the context in which they find themselves.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And just to be fair, I do think that there have been the occasional debates with presuppositionalists that they've done well. And I think that if you listen to the Greg Bahnsen, Gordon Stein debate, that was pretty clearly on Greg Bahnsen's side, which is, I think that debate alone popularized presuppositionalism to a large extent. But I think for the most part, you're exactly right, that it really just doesn't hold up in actual practical discussion and conversation. And I
think it's so counterintuitive that most people, this is part of the problem with it. I think you have to kind of prove the philosophy underlying it, or show that that's reasonable and that's something that should be accepted. And then you have to show that Christianity is something to be accepted on top of that. So there's like a two-step procedure. And since the philosophy, I think, is so controversial, it makes the proof of Christianity, or the arguments in favor of Christianity, very weak, because they're based upon this philosophy that itself is very contested. So I think we need to start off with the common sense assumptions the classicalist does, and that most people share, and then we can start arguing for the truth of Christianity, and we don't need to presuppose this philosophy that's going to leave people scratching their heads and thinking, wow, this sounds really counterintuitive.
Yeah. The issue of common sense, I think, is a really good point. And most of modern philosophy, starting with Descartes, really goes very much against common sense. I mean, realism is just the default position that people have.
Right. That's right. So let's just get right into talking about Christianity and talking about the evidence and the arguments that we have for Christianity. When we start talking about interpretation and getting into all these epistemological issues, we haven't even come close to talking about the Lordship of Christ. We're still dealing with epistemological issues, and I think that in a lot of cases they never really get past those epistemological issues.
Right. All right. Well, this is a great conversation. I'm sure that there will be quite a few responses to this. And this is an issue that's always heated, but it'll be interesting to see how people do respond. So, Dr. Greeley, if people do have questions for you or want to interact, is there a way that you would prefer them to reach out to you through Facebook or email or something else?
Yeah, Facebook's fine.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you so much for joining us again. And just a reminder to everyone who is watching or listening to this, that Dr. Greeley's seminar on Anselm's Doctrine of God is coming up next month. That is August of 2020, in case you're watching or listening to this way later. But if you are watching or listening later, you should be able to purchase the course in the video of the course as well. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for watching/listening. God bless.